This is part 2 of the ideology and the culture wars presentation. I ended part 1 with the monk lectures of 218. I briefly touched on Michael Eric Dyson, who represented the black position, and how in the racist issue of ideology, there is often seen as the oppressor and the oppressed class, and if one dares to differ with the oppressed class, then one is seen, it's a circular argument, then you must be part of the oppressor class. The same thing, for example, is played out in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. If one dares to critique the state of Israel, then one is called anti-Semitic. If you're a Jew, then you're a Jew hater. Who wants to be anti-Semitic or a Jew hater? Therefore, the state of Israel is often not critiqued, and then so this ends discussion. So this is, again, culture wars very much at work, and how ideology, there's a form of ideology that ends discussion by saying the other is the enemy, I'm the innocent victim, the sacrificial lamb. How dare any group, particularly what is seen as the historic oppressor group, critique me. The same thing can be played out, for example, in when people dare critique elements of Islam. They're called Islamic phobic. Who wants to be Islamophobic? Therefore, people don't critique, even are fretful of critiquing the worst excesses of Islam. And of course, the right is very quick to critique elements of terrorism and violence, and then they're accused of Islamophobia, when in fact they're just touching on legitimate facts. Of course, the violence and the terrorists don't define Islam. Islam is far bigger than that, but a way of short-circuiting meaningful discussion is to say someone's phobic, or they're anti-Semitic, or they're an oppressor class. Well, where does a person go from there? It's basing in logic. It's called an ad hominem argument. In that way. And so in that sense, the black issue be a bit like people who, because it's often a field day on Christianity, and people critique Christianity, well, then you're called Christophobic. What we will apply often to the state of, when critique Israel, anti-Semitic, people don't know what to do with that, or Islamophobic, don't know what to do with that. So what about the full-scale critique of Christianity? What if Christians turned that around and say, well, you're Christophobic, you're fearing, so one has to be careful constantly of how circular arguments are used to silence critical thinking. And at the heart of the best elements of Western thought is critical thinking. The second woman, as I mentioned in the monk lectures, was Michelle Goldberg, and she's seen as one of the leading feminists, who articulates very clearly that white males have been the problem, females have been oppressed, and now the time has come for the male voice. And anytime you get a white male daring to criticize, well, we're back to the oppressor class. Interesting enough, she has really clashed, as I mentioned earlier, with other, particularly the whole gender movement. And we have seen this played out in Vancouver, that's in the early part of this year, with Megan Murphy, who in one sense has affinities with Michelle Goldberg, in arguing that let's not have feminism as an ideological construct go down the route of transgenderism or certain views of intersectionality or the LGBTQ. And so within this, what is seen as the oppressed tradition, everyone in the or different groups in the oppressed tradition will argue they're more oppressed than someone else. So who really becomes the oppressor and who the oppressed? The more one parses this in narrower and narrower segments of thinking when it comes to gender, when it comes to identity, and all of these situations. And then, as I mentioned, Stephen Fry tried to represent a less strident ideological position and point out that in fact, there is subtler ways of approaching these issues, more nuanced ways of understanding the hot button issues in the culture wars. And a person on the center soft left can raise questions about narrow ideological reads of issues of gender and race and identity and a whole range of issues. And then Jordan Peterson, who was seen as someone who was questioning that very simplistic epistemology of reducing things to oppressor and oppressed, as if these are only two categories in which a person can make sense of issues. Now, a couple of other issues I'd like to briefly look at as we move along in the ideology and the culture wars. One would be the whole issue of crime and punishment. And anyone who's in criminology, for example, has to look at four models of that. If a person's on the right, they tend to see retributive justice as the way of handling crime. A person has used their liberty in a certain way. They lose their liberty. They're rational, moral beings. They have not used their thinking, their lack of morality in a meaningful way, and so there are consequences of that. Imprisonment. If a person's more on the soft left, it's rehabilitative justice, and people are not just rational beings, they're emotional beings, they're conditional beings. If a person is growing up in a context of violence and oppression, they are likely, almost as genetically or in a conditioned way, to deal with conflict or difficulty in a violent way, either verbally or physically. And so the clash between retributive justice, rehabilitative, restorative justice, transformative justice, these are heated areas for people in the as Dostoevsky would talk about, the crime and punishment areas. Obviously, the environment issue is very, very much one before us, and that's going to be one of the chapters we're doing in our book, along with feminism, environmentalism, multiculturalism, and then religion, both at its best and its worst. But there's a great division within the culture wars on the far right and the soft right. How do we deal with global warming? And is there global warming? Well, nobody denies that, more or less, but the explanations of why there's global warming, that's what's going to divide the right and the left. The more a person moves to center left, they're going to argue the role of corporations and big multinationals, and the ledger of profit and loss has led us to the point where we're polluting the sky, the water, the land, and there are implications for this. The glaciers melting, obviously, in the Arctic. What's happening there is going to have an implication as water rises. And so at an ideological level, the issue is, when it comes to environmental issues, whose interpretation of what is happening, the causes of what is happening, and then by extension, how does one deal with what is happening? And so when we look at ideology, one of the things we touch on is just not diagnosing the problem, but offering a prognosis, but practically speaking, in the trenches, what is to be done. And so when we come to the environmental issue, there are those who feel you can't trust the state, you can't trust political parties, and so protest is the key issue in terms of dealing with the environment, and that people are out on the streets and raising the questions of environmental crisis. But who does one protest to? Inevitably, you protest to government. The hope is that by voices are raised loud enough, letters come in long enough, that in fact people are going to get the message and change will be made. Then there's advocacy groups, such as the Sierra Club, Greenpeace. Now, Greenpeace brings together, of course, activism, environmental activism, with advocacy. And so is advocacy, but then, of course, the question that has to be asked is advocating to who? Well, the advocacy is done inevitably to government in the hope that they are going to move structurally in altering how business is run, how oil is transferred, how energy is delivered. Now, someone like Elizabeth May in Canada, who has been head of the Green Party, her journey is a very interesting one because it reflects the transition not only of analyzing the ideological issues we face, but how we act on those ideological issues. So she starts as a lawyer in the Maritimes, looking at how soil is being polluted, what the implications are for food, which is very, very much dealing with the courts, challenging multinationals. She then gets contacted by the Sierra Club after a brief stint in what was then the Progressive Conservative Party to work for an advocacy group. And the role of advocacy groups is to think through what the issues are we're facing environmentally, and then to begin to act on that, not only from grassroots up, but also expecting at a provincial, municipal, and federal level choices to be made. But of course, for Elizabeth May, her understanding was very clearly that, well, where are the big choices made that affect a nation, would affect nations, and so then, of course, she becomes the head of the Green Party. So the issue in ideology and politics is not only about interpretation of issues, but how we act on our interpretation. This divides the environmental group, both in interpretations between activists, advocacy groups, and then people who are formally within political parties believing it is they who bring the changes themselves. Other issues, of course, we could look at as we move into the culture wars is homelessness, poverty, who's responsible for it. And of course, if a person's on the right, to some degree, they're going to argue choices made by people. They're living with the consequences of their choices. Hence, why should people pay higher taxes to be spent on people who have misused their freedom? And if a person's on the soft left, of course, they're going to argue there's more to what it means to be human than rational choosing beings, but we're affected by chemicals, we're affected by upbringing. There's a whole variety of causes which make people what they are, and so a little more sensitivity to people on the fringes is called for. So here on the right, you can see freedom misuse leads to a lack of freedom and a lack of having possessions, property, other possibilities, and people have misused the freedom, so they're in their dire circumstances, either in poverty, on the streets, homeless, and the left will come along and say, well, there's more to people, interestingly enough, than just freedom, okay, and choice. There are other things that make people what they become, and at a certain point, both communities and the states has to assist them within that. When we come to the issue for many that has really become, well, a couple of issues which are really hot button issues these days are the LGBTQI. When we touch down on issues of identity, gender, all of these issues, there are debates within the LGBTQI community about freedom. They feel they have been marginalized, outsiders, misunderstood, not heard, victims against an oppressor culture, what I've mentioned in an earlier lecture, Foucault, an episteme culture in which there is a legitimate way of knowing, and if a person doesn't fit within that accepted way of knowing and being, they are not going to be given the same access to power, to positions of privilege than those who accept a certain worldview. So the LGBTQI community in the culture wars, and particularly studying at university and publications and media and culture, and some obviously the terrible violence which has occurred to people who come from this particular position and an understanding of themselves on their journey. Now, if a person's on the right, obviously they're going to argue this understanding of freedom and identity is highly problematic, and who in that sense defines identity. And this is where, of course, we get into underneath the premises of liberalism itself is the bigger question of human nature. Is human nature an open-ended project in which people can write, or initially, of course, people are written on the text of their lives from their upbringing, what they are expected to be, but at a certain page they start writing back? Are we just open-ended pages that are written on, or a canvas in which people paint on and we paint back on in our journey? And identity in that sense, to some degree, is liquid. You can change it just as you change clothes. Or is there the notion, as in the classical sense, there's such thing called a human nature. And just as an acorn becomes an oak tree, a sunflower seed becomes a sunflower plant. In fact, the task of delving ever deeper into knowing nature is a part of what the educational process is. So within the right, when it comes to human nature, there is this notion that there is a structure, an innate structure in what it means to be human, And the role of thinking is to understand what that structure is. On the left, it tends to be much more an open-ended project in which the possibilities are infinite. Just as we can have a multiplicity of desires and impressions, and who's to say which impression or desire is legitimate, the open-ended notion of certain elements of late modernity or post-modernity when it comes to human identity argues that there is no criteria really when it comes to identity and gender and different ways of self-definition, whereas the right will say there are such things as a structure versus post-structuralism. There is good, better, best when it comes to desires. There is bad, worst, worse. Versus what we would call as an egalitarianism of desires or democracy of desires. The right will argue at a deeper level there's a hierarchy of desires. And at this deeper level, as we get to it in the culture wars, it really comes to a question of human nature, and are all desires equally valid and can be indulged, enjoyed, feasted at the table of multiple objects of those desires? Or are there some desires which are good, better, best, some that are right, some that are wrong? And so when we get to the culture wars and ideology, the deeper question in which this trail takes us is to one of human nature and desire and longing itself for meaning. And the language of equality and the language of hierarchy often clash on this. And so the role of education, is it to pander to equal desires, whatever and however they're defined at any given time, or is it to discern deeper desires, higher desires, lesser desires? And this is where you get a clash in the culture wars at the deeper level beyond, in which premises of liberalism collide with the ambiguous understanding of human nature and the clash between these two approaches of human nature. One is hierarchically oriented. One argues there is form. One argues there is structure. The other argues all egalitarianism of desires, and individuals can use their freedom in choice as agents to give free play to whatever desires are bubbling to the surface at every given time, and there is not necessarily any right or wrong in these particular desires. And so there are many other issues I obviously could cover in the culture wars, but important to recognize that there are underneath it all a deeper questioning of human nature itself, structure, post-structure, form, freedom, equality, hierarchy, and these come to have an impact then on how we make sense of specific issues or content issues in the culture wars. And without a deeper investigation of the issues of human nature and where those two understandings lead, because they do take us to different destinations on the human cultural, literary, political, religious journey, they do lead to different ideological families or homes in the culture wars. And so with that, I will end part 2 of ideology and the culture wars.